اللهم صل على محمد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه والتابعين لهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم وفيهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. To proceed, in this lesson we will continue our discussion of Hajj, which we covered in our last lesson, is linguistically to intend or seek out someone or something revered, and in the definition of the sacred law, to travel to the house or to intend the house for the purpose of rites of Hajj, and Umrah is to visit the house for the purpose of performing the rites of Umrah. And in our last lesson we asked Allah to grant us the ability to list from memory the integrals of Hajj, or the pillars of Hajj. Right? A pillar in this chapter is also called a fard. And this is the one chapter where a fard differs from a wajib in the Shafi'i school. So the pillars of Hajj, or the furud of Hajj, integrals of Hajj, are 5. The first being al-ihram, right? Al-ihram. The second being standing at Arafah. The third being Tawaf al-ifada, that they also call Tawaf al-rukn, or the integral circumambulation. The next being sa'i, and the last being removing hair by shaving or shortening. So those are 5 integrals: ihram, tawaf, sa'i, ihram, arafah, tawaf, sa'i, and shaving or shortening the hair. Those are the 5 integrals of the Hajj. And we asked Allah to grant us to recall the beginning and end times, if there was an end, for each of those integrals. Also, in the case of ihram, to understand what the definition of ihram was. So ihram is to intend to enter the state, or to intend to perform Hajj and Umrah. Ihram is the intention to perform Hajj or Umrah. So ihram is the intention, not the clothing you wear when you are in that state, which is also named the clothing of ihram. That is clothing for ihram, but ihram is the intention. So ihram is to intend Hajj or intend Umrah. And you would state, I intend Hajj. Nawaitul Hajj wa ahramtu bihi lillahi ta'ala. I intend Hajj. I intend Hajj. Translated, I intend to perform the Hajj, and I sanctify myself thereby for Allah. Or you could say, I enter ihram thereby for Allah. Or I intend Umrah, and I enter ihram thereby for Allah. Nawaitul Hajj wa ahramtu bihi lillahi ta'ala. Tayyib, the time for ihram of Hajj are the 3 Hajj months, which are Shawwal, Dhul Qa'dah, and the first 10 nights, or the eves, up to the eve before the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, right? So you have to have entered ihram for Hajj before Fajr on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. If you have not entered ihram by Fajr on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, you have missed your opportunity to enter ihram for Hajj, right? So that is the time for entering ihram for Hajj, and you remain in ihram until you are released from ihram, which we will discuss in our next lesson, inshallah. How are you partially and fully released from ihram? So ihram, its time is Shawwal, Dhul Qa'dah or Dhul Qa'dah, and the 10 of Dhul Hijjah. Arafah, and the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Hajju Arafah. The standing at Arafah, its time begins with the entrance of Dhuhr times, Dhuhr prayer's time, which is the Zawal, when the sun has crossed the zenith, on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah. Standing at Arafah begins when the Dhuhr time enters on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah. right? So Arafah is from Dhuhr on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, and it lasts to just before the rising of the true dawn on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. You have to be present at Arafah without having lost intellect or reason, without being unconscious, even if you're moving, even if you're asleep during some portion of that time, you have to be present at Arafah. So its beginning is with Dhuhr on the 9th. It ends with Fajr on the 10th. That is the standing of Arafah, the most important of the pillars of the Hajj. Tawaf al-Ifada, also called Tawaf al-Rukn, the integral Tawaf, right? So there's a Tawaf that's an integral, and there is a Tawaf that is a duty or a wajib, and we'll talk about that in what follows in today's lesson after we finish reviewing our last lesson. Tawaf al-Ifada, its time enters with the midpoint between Maghrib and Fajr on the eve, meaning the night before the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. Right? Tawaf al-Ifada begins at the midpoint of the night on the eve before the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, which is after you have left Arafah and after the pilgrims have spent some of the night at least at Muzdalifah. They go forth and they do this going forth tawaf, which is, again, the night, its time enters at the midpoint in the night, and that is the eve before the 10th of the Hijjah. So if Maghrib was 6 p.m. and Fajr was 6 a.m., it would be at exactly midnight. That's unlikely to have it exactly at those times, so you divide the time between Maghrib and Fajr in half to determine what is the midpoint between those. That is when the time of Tawaf al-Ifada begins. Tawaf Ifada does not have an end time. You may perform it as is explicitly mentioned in our text. We will cover that later, as long as you are alive. Sa'i, it does not have a chronological beginning, but it has a sequential beginning. Sa'i, which is to go between Safa and Marwa, must follow a tawaf. Right? Sa'i must follow a tawaf. Either the sunnah arrival tawaf, people who arrive in ihram for Hajj, it is sunnah for them to do a tawaf when they first arrive in Mecca. This is called Tawaf al-Qudum, or the arrival tawaf. If they wish, they may place their sa'i after that. If they did not do their sa'i after the arrival tawaf, then their sa'i must follow their Tawaf Ifada. So sa'i has a sequential beginning, not a chronological beginning, and that is that it must follow Tawaf. La ilaha illallah, sa'i, like Tawaf al-Ifada, does not have an ending. Right? As long as you're alive, you may perform the sa'i. And then the last of these 5 integrals of Hajj is shaving or shortening the hair, which is accomplished by removing part of 3 hairs of the head, by shaving them, by cutting them, by plucking them, etc. But you remove part of 3 hairs. It is recommended that a man shave his head and that a woman shorten her hair. And again, that is accomplished with 3 hairs. The time for that begins with the middle of the night on the eve of the 10th, the same way as Tawaf al-Ifada, and the time exits with death. It has no ending. So those are 5 integrals: Ihram, the integral Tawaf, Ihram, standing at Arafah, the integral Tawaf, Sa'i, which is going between Safa and Marwa, and shaving or shortening the hair. Those are the 5 integrals, and those are the times. That was our lesson last week. And if someone had done those and done them correctly, one's Hajj would be valid. And not need to be making effort to be made up, and one would have performed the Hajj of Islam. If one of them is not performed or is not performed correctly, one has not made a valid Hajj, and one may not be released from Ihram until it is done properly. So it behooves us to be cautious about those. And as was mentioned, Hajj is the last of the pillars of Islam. Hajj is a revival of our covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it behooves us to learn this knowledge of how to perform it, and we should take a more thorough course immediately prior to our Hajj. And also, it is a recommendation to make Hajj along with those who are knowledgeable so that they can lead one through one's rites. And when one needs to ask detailed questions of expiations and so on, or corrections of mistakes, they will be able to give you fatwa on those detailed questions. And that is a recommendation. And we ask Allah to grant us to perform accepted pilgrimages to His house in khair and lutf and afiyah. In this lesson, we ask Allah to grant us ability to answer questions about the validity of tawaf and sa'i using our notes and our text. Right? We're going to talk about conditions for tawaf and conditions for sa'i. It's treated in relative detail in the text, and we will give some more detail in our notes. And we should be able to answer questions about that. Someone comes and says, I only did 6 circuits around the Kaaba. Is my tawaf valid? We should be able to answer that. Someone says, I want to do tawaf, the masjid is crowded, I want to do tawaf in the courtyard outside of the masjid. Can I do that? We should be able to answer questions about that. Also, that we can list the duties from memory as well as their beginning and end times. And we ask Allah that by His mercy, and He is the most merciful of the merciful. So we've learned in summary, or in a summary treatment, these 5 integrals or arkan, pillars of Hajj. And those are the furud. In our school, the duties will differ, and we will memorize those. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So our author says, discussing the conditions of tawaf and the conditions of sa'i, necessary for the tawaf are the covering of the awrah. Right? So he's beginning to mention conditions of tawaf, conditions of circumambulating the Kaaba. What does it mean to circumambulate the Kaaba? Circumambulating the Kaaba is a great, great work that all of the prophets performed from Adam's time until the time of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. And when Allah ordered the heavens and the earth to obey willingly or unwillingly, they said, we come willingly. The first place to respond on the earth was the spot that the Kaaba is in. And the earth was spread forth from that spot. And Allah caused a celestial house of worship called Al-Bayt Al-Ma'mur. We could say that the house which is frequented with worshippers, or the house which thrives with worshippers. And that's a house that 70 angels enter a day to worship in and do not exit or do not enter again once they have entered. So that was caused to descend to the spot which is now the Kaaba. And that was due to the prayer of Adam alayhi salam in his loneliness and alienation in the earth. He was given Al-Bayt Al-Ma'mur as a comfort. And he was ordered by the angels to circumambulate Al-Bayt Al-Ma'mur the same way in which the angels circumambulate the Arsh, the throne of the divine, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that was a prophetic work, that was an emulation of an angelic work, the circumambulation of the angels of the Kaaba. And Adam alayhi salam worshipped at Al-Bayt Al-Ma'mur, and it continued to be a place of worship at the site of the Kaaba until the flood, where it was raised, and it now exists in the heavens, in the space above and adjacent to the Kaaba itself. And the Prophet ﷺ visited Al-Bayt Al-Ma'mur on the night of Isra and Mi'raj. Ibrahim alayhi salam was leaning against it, and the Prophet ﷺ said 70 angels enter it, and once they enter, they do not return again. So many, many, many angels enter it and worship there at the Bayt Al-Ma'mur. So the Bayt Ma'mur, other than the black stone, was raised, and the Kaaba was re-erected in that place by Ibrahim and Ismail. After Ibrahim had been commanded to leave Ismail and his mother in Mecca. And prior to the re-erection of the Kaaba, there was a raised space there, and the floods, when they would come into the valley, they would go around it. And Ibrahim knew he was leaving them at Allah's house. However, it was to be re-erected later when Ismail was a young man, and Ibrahim returned and re-erected the Kaaba where it now stands in the life of Ibrahim and Ismail. And all of the prophets made a pilgrimage to the Kaaba and made this circumambulation that you make. And the most noble stone in the Kaaba, the black stone, which remains, was a jewel that was initially white from Jannah, that was part of Al-Bayt al-Ma'mur, that was again that celestial house of worship that was descended by Allah, or sent down by Allah by the prayer of Adam and then later raised, except the black stone. So that is the Kaaba that you circumambulate. And it's reminiscent of our covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and a reaffirmation of our covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For Allah, when He took the covenant that is mentioned in Surah 7, verse 172, Allah said to us, "Am I not your Lord?" And we testified to His Lordship. All of those who testified, their names were written on a scroll that was embedded in the black stone. And the black stone, the Prophet ﷺ said in Sahih Hadith, will be resurrected and have an eloquent tongue and testify to the monotheism of those who came to the Kaaba and made their pilgrimage. So when you circumambulate, that is what you're doing, and you're circumambulating the house of Allah. So there are conditions that you should follow, and there is knowledge that you should learn, and there's etiquettes that you should have, and we should be extremely cautious of disobeying Allah. And from the types of disobedience of Allah are looking down on the believers or looking at their faults when we're at the Kaaba. We should fulfill these conditions, one of them being covering our awrah, translated as nakedness. The awrah is what you are obliged to cover and forbidden to look at on others. And that is the same awrah as that of prayer. The men must cover what's between their navel and the knees. The women must cover everything excluding their hands and their faces. That is a condition. So the awrah must be covered during Tawaf. So men have to be cautious about their izar not falling below their belly button, or not wearing it too high so that it comes up above their knees. They must be careful about the opacity of their izar, because if you can see one's skin complexion at a distance of about 140 some centimeters, you can see their skin under that. That is not considered a covering. So if it has holes and so on, or is thin, and some of them unfortunately can be thin like that, it is not sufficient as a covering of the awrah. One should be cautious of that, or if your awrah becomes exposed, it must be recovered and before you continue to make your tawaf. The state of tahara, that means to be in a state of purity, ritual purity, right? He continues, the state of purity from things which invalidate it and from najasa. So you have to be in a state of ritual purity, meaning that you performed wudu and or ghusl should you be obliged to do so, and that you remain in a state of ritual purity, that you're not in a state of hadath, a state of ritual impurity, which is what requires wudu or ghusl. La ilaha illallah, and also that you're free from legal impurities, legal filth like blood or human excretions, and so on. You cannot make tawaf when you are ritually impure or physically impure, and you should be cautious of that. An exception is dry pigeon droppings may be stepped on if you cannot avoid them, and that is something that does happen at al-Masjid al-Haram because of the it's being a large exposed cathedral and or masjid, and pigeons will tend to fly in spaces like that. But not when it's wet. It is not excused when it is wet, or if it is easy to avoid. La ilaha illallah. So you have to be physically pure from filth, from najasa, and ritually pure. The tawaf must be 7 circles, right? 7 circuits around the Kaaba. And these circuits must begin at the black stone, right? And the black stone is marked now by lights that are green lights on the part of the mosque which is opposite the black stone, that when you cross the black stone, that is where your circuit begins, and you end by crossing it to the same point, right? So you go completely around the Kaaba 7 times, and you're going counterclockwise, which will be depicted by his saying that the Kaaba is on your left. So there have to be 7 circuits. If you are not certain, you have to do enough that you are certain. So if you said, oh, did I do 6 or 7? You have to do 1 more. If a circuit is interrupted by a loss of purity, you can go and renew your wudu and come back and continue where you left off, right? So if you've done 4 complete tawafs and you lose your ablution, you can come back and then you just have 3 more to do. But you must do 7 circuits or 7 circles inside the mosque. So you must do tawaf inside the mosque. You can do it at the various levels of the mosque, but you cannot do it outside of the mosque. There's a large courtyard outside of the mosque. If it's conceivable that someone would walk totally around that 7 times, that would not be valid because you are not inside the mosque. You must be inside the mosque, though you can be on the various levels of the mosque. Keeping the house on one's left, right? So you must be inside the mosque, and the Kaaba, which is what's meant by saying the house, al-bayt, it must be on your left, not in front of you, or not with your back to it, or not with your right hand to it, right? So if someone were to do tawaf spinning, for instance, that would not be valid because some of their steps were taken without the Kaaba to their left side. And you're going counterclockwise and the Kaaba is to your left. And sometimes the crowd will push you. Try not to take steps when you've been turned towards the Kaaba or away from the Kaaba or with your right to the Kaaba. Try not to take steps during that condition. And if the crowd forced you to do so, those steps would not count. So for instance, if you were to take steps going the right direction but walking backwards with your right to the Kaaba, those steps would not count. So you would have to retrace them and continue where you left off or make another circuit to make up for those missteps of that circuit. The house must be on one's left, and that one is not actually inside the Kaaba. So you have to be inside the mosque but outside of the Kaaba. Someone might ask, why would the fuqaha say you have to be outside of the Kaaba? Because the foundation, the original foundation of the Kaaba, upon which Ibrahim and Ismail alayhim as-salam re-erected the house, it's actually larger than the Kaaba is at present, right? The original space of the Kaaba, that house of worship, which was the first house placed for humanity to worship Allah, that has existed since Adam's time, was worshipped at by angels prior to Adam's time. By 2,000 years, that space is actually larger than the present Kaaba. And that is because during the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, in his 35th year, when Quraysh rebuilt the Kaaba, they ran out of pure and halal funds, so they reduced their building costs, if you will, because of a lack of materials by making the Kaaba slightly smaller. So in the direction of the Hijr of Ismail, the Kaaba, the real Kaaba actually extends. And the Hijr of Ismail is that semicircle that is next to the Kaaba. Some of that is actually inside the Kaaba, a number of cubits. And also the foundation has been shrunk in some other directions. So the buttress that is at the base of the Kaaba, in some directions, and there's a difference of opinion about which, it could be all, is actually extending over the original foundation of the Kaaba. So the upshot of this saying you must be outside of the Kaaba is that when you make tawaf, you cannot cut through the Hijr of Ismail, right? If you were to do tawaf around just the square house and cut through the Hijr of Ismail, that would not count because you are not outside of the Kaaba. During some of your steps, you are within the original foundation of the Kaaba. Or if you did, as some do, for instance, when they're trying to kiss the black stone, you walked along the buttress of the Kaaba or dragged your hand against the Kaaba with your hand extended over the buttress. So your hand is inside the Kaaba, or if you're walking, your body is inside the Kaaba, in that for those steps, those do not count. So when you are close to the Kaaba, don't allow yourself to be pushed up onto the buttress or drag your hand along the Kaaba while making tawaf. If you wish to touch it or to kiss it, and that is excellent, but don't take those steps while your hand is extended over the buttress and dragging along the wall of the Kaaba, because technically your hand is or may be within the boundaries of the Kaaba. So those steps do not count from your tawaf, particularly those who are going to touch the Rukn Yamani. They should be careful not to take steps while they are touching it, and the crowd may be inclined to make them do so. La ilaha illallah. So those are some of the conditions for tawaf. Those are conditions for tawaf, that our awrah be covered, we cover our nakedness, that we be in a state of ritual and physical purity. And the Prophet ﷺ taught us that tawaf is like prayer. So do not speak with other than, except that speech is allowed. So he ordered us not to speak with other than good. So you are like in a state of prayer, and you must cover your awrah and be pure like you are in a state of prayer when you perform your tawaf. And that you do 7 circuits that you're sure of, and that you keep the Kaaba on your left, that you be inside the mosque and outside of the Kaaba during your circumambulation of the Kaaba, and Allah knows best. Then he mentions conditions of sa'i, and as we mentioned, sa'i is when you go between Safa and Marwa. So when Sayyidatuna Hajar, the mother of Ismail, was left by Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he turned and departed, and she followed him, calling to him, and he didn't respond. And then she asked if Allah has commanded us, has Allah commanded you to do this? And he said yes. Then she said, our Lord will not allow us to go without, or our Lord will not neglect us, right? And she was of immense yaqeen, and he had left some provisions with them, and when those provisions ran out, she began to look for water for young Ismail, and she went 7 times between Safa and Marwa, which were 2 hills or small mountains, and she climbed to each of them and then went to the other, searching for water, until eventually she heard the angelic voice, and Jibril alayhi salam stomped the ground that was at the feet of Ismail, and the well of Zamzam sprung up. So we trace the steps of Sayyidatuna Hajar, the mother of Ismail, in her search for water prior to her being given the well of Zamzam. So these are conditions for the sa'i. The sa'i, and what is that? To run, or to walk intensely, or run, or go to something directly. But this is a running or a going between Safa and Marwa. The sa'i must be done 7 times, right? But each length is counted as 1, right? So we would call it 7 lengths between Safa and Marwa, that it must be 7. It must be after the tawaf. Sa'i has a sequential timing that it occurs after tawaf. Either the arrival tawaf, which is sunnah, either after the sunnah arrival tawaf, or after the integral tawaf. We perform this integral of sa'i. It must begin at Safa, right, and end at Marwa. The Prophet ﷺ say, begin with what Allah began with, right? And Allah mentions Safa first in the Quran. So one starts at Safa and goes to Marwa, that's 1. Marwa to Safa is 2. Safa to Marwa is 3. Marwa to Safa is 4. Safa to Marwa 5. Marwa to Safa 6. Safa to Marwa 7. So you begin at Safa, end at Marwa. Odd lengths are between Safa and Marwa. Even lengths are between Marwa and Safa, until you are up to 7. Up to 7. You do not have to be pure. It is sunnah. You do not have to, as a condition, awrah being covered is not a condition, but it's an obligation anyway, because you are in the presence of others and you must cover your awrah. But those are actually not conditions in this case, meaning that if you lost your ritual purity, your sa'i would still be valid, and if your awrah came uncovered accidentally, your sa'i would still be valid. Though those are sunnahs for the sa'i, as well as many other sunnahs for the sa'i and for the hajj, and we will cover some of those in our next lesson. Which brings us to the wajibat, the duties, right? And he's going to talk to us about integrals, about duties, and about sunnahs, and the difference between each. Here we are just listing the duties or the wajibat. Furud, which are the integrals. Everywhere else in the Shafi'i school, a fard and a wajib is the same thing, except this chapter, right? In Hajj, in the Shafi'i school, a fard differs from a wajib. And he's going to explain that difference later. For now, we just want you to memorize these 5 wajibat, these 5 duties. And it's easy. We had 5 integrals. Inshallah, we can all list them from memory. Now we have 5 duties. We can list those from memory. So he says, the wajibat of Hajj are being in a state of ihram from the miqat. And you have a footnote for the miqats. Though he doesn't list them, we'll give them to you. Okay, being in ihram from the miqat. All right, what is the miqat? The miqat is the geographical boundary for entering ihram. Right. So we said. Entering ihram has a time, right? You could say it has chronological limits. Entering ihram also has geographical limits or boundaries, right? You can only enter ihram for Hajj at certain times. You must enter ihram prior to passing certain points along your journey for Hajj. You must enter ihram prior to passing certain points on your journey to Hajj. Those points are called a miqat. Each of them is called a miqat. The plural is mawaqit. So those are the geographical boundaries prior to which you must enter ihram when you are performing Hajj. They were designated specifically by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there are 5 for other than those who are residing in Mecca, right? There are 5 mawaqit, 5 miqats, if you will, 5 geographical boundaries prior to which you are obliged, it is a duty to enter ihram. So these geographical points or these places, these mawaqit, for the people of Yemen, it's called Yalamlam, right? For the people of Najd, it's called Qarn, meaning if someone's traveling from Yemen, they have to enter ihram prior to passing a place called Yalamlam. If they're traveling from Najd, which is like eastern Saudi Arabia, that direction, they have to enter ihram prior to passing a place called Qarn. And historically, the Hajj routes would pass these places. They were well known. If they're traveling from Iraq or Central Asia, it's a place called That Irq. If they are traveling from Egypt or North Africa, it's a place called Juhfa, El Juhfa, which is along the Red Sea coast. If they are traveling from El Medina or further north, like Syria, the miqat is called Dhul Hulayfa, right? Also called Abar Ali, the wells of Ali, and that is the miqat from which Al-Habib sallallahu alayhi wasallam entered ihram. How do we find these? Our navigators tell us of them, right? So if you're making Hajj by land and you're already in a Medina, your bus driver is going to drive you to Dhul Hulayfa and stop there, or tell you prior to driving past. If you are flying, we are typically from our part of the world, we are going to be told, because we're coming down like from Egypt, we're going to be told by our pilot prior to passing Al-Juhfa that we must enter our ihram. So you must enter ihram prior to passing these sites, right? You could enter ihram a day before. You could enter ihram 1,000 miles before the miqat. You could enter ihram in JFK prior to getting on your plane. But then you're going to have to stay in Ihram longer. And it would be better to wait, and your pilot will tell you prior to passing your miqat. Just make sure you don't sleep through it. So the first duty is being in a state of ihram from the miqat or prior to the miqat. Al-ihram min al-miqat. So not past the miqat. And again, what is a state of ihram? Ihram is the intention to perform Hajj or Umrah, right? So you must make that intention prior to or from the miqat, okay? What if you go past, you haven't fulfilled this obligation and there's going to be an expiation, or you have to go back? If it was land travel, you could go back and then come back down from the miqat. Otherwise, there's an issue. We'll talk about that in our next lesson. So that is the first, ihram from the miqat. Second, the spending of the night before the day of slaughter at Muzdalifah. Okay, the day of slaughter is the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. The day of slaughter is the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. That is the day that people who are not on Hajj are celebrating Eid al-Adha, right? It is the day after the day of Arafah. The day of Arafah is the 9th. So the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, we spend the night before that at a place called Muzdalifah that is between Arafah and Mina, right? So spending the night at Muzdalifah is a wajib. What is the timing for spending the night at Muzdalifah? Spending the night at Muzdalifah is accomplished by being at Muzdalifah for one moment past the midpoint of the night, and that is on the eve of the 10th, or the night before the day of slaughter, right? So we said 6 p.m. Maghrib, that's the example we're using. 6 a.m. Fajr. The midpoint of the night is when? 12. So at 12:01, you have to be there for a moment at Muzdalifah, even driving through, and you've accomplished the spending of the night at Muzdalifah. That is how it's understood in our school, right? You just have to be there for a moment past the middle of the night. The Prophet ﷺ allowed those who were weak to go ahead on from Muzdalifah and not stay there the whole night. It is sunnah to stay there the whole night and to pray Fajr there prior to moving on. You've accomplished the duty by being there for a moment past the middle of the night. The next duty, spending the nights of Tashriq at Mina. Right, you have all these places. You have Arafah, you have Muzdalifah, you have Mina. These are various sites that the pilgrims, or stations to which the pilgrims go, or in which they spend a night. We went to Arafah, where we were at on the 9th. After night fell, we moved to Muzdalifah. We remained at Muzdalifah until past the middle of the night. Then we move on, and the next night we're going to spend at Mina. So we spend the nights of Tashriq at Mina, which are the night before the 11th, the night before the 12th, and if you're going to stay for the second, to be of the second group who leaves Mina, an-Nafar al-Thani, you will also stay the night before the 13th day of the Hijjah. So the 11th, 12th, and 13th days of the Hijjah are called the days of Tashriq, Ayyam at-Tashriq. And the evenings before those, the night before the 11th of the Hijjah, the night before the 12th of the Hijjah, the night before the 13th of the Hijjah, those are the nights that the pilgrims are required. They have the duty to stay at Mina. What does staying the night at Mina mean? It has a broader meaning than staying the night at Muzdalifah. Staying the night at Mina means that you are present at Mina for the majority of the night. Staying the night at Mina means that you are present at Mina for the majority of the night. What is the majority? The most, 51% is the majority, right? So, for instance, so let's say 6 o'clock Maghrib, 6 a.m. Fajr, the midpoint of the night is midnight, so that's a 12-hour night, you would have to stay 6 hours and 1 minute, right? You stay from Maghrib to just past the middle of the night, or from just before the middle of the night till Fajr, or 7 hours right smack in the middle of the night, and then you go into Mecca and make Tawaf or something. But you have to be there for the majority of the night, which is the greater portion, right? If it's a 12-hour night, 6 hours and a minute or more, or you understand what I'm saying. La ilaha illallah. That is staying the night at Mina, and that is for the nights before the 11th, 12th, and possibly the 13th of Dhul Hijjah. And for those who do not want to depart after on the 12th, they can depart on the 12th if they like. La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. The throwing of stones against the pillars. MashaAllah, we take exception to that translation. Stoning the Jamarat is a better way to say it. Okay, stoning the Jamarat. The pillars mark the Jamarat, but they are not the target that is stoned. Right? What is stoned is what's being marked, which is at the base of those pillars. And historically, it was an area around the base of the pillar that used to be like a big vat or tub that was dry, and people would stone that space. The first of them might have just stoned the ground, right? But then stones would pile up, and they would stone there. Now, essentially, you're stoning into a funnel that pours into the Jamrah, right? And the markers have become huge, like walls. So we must stone these stoning places that are called Jamarat. Okay? Some of the books divide the stonings into two types. This book, for simplicity's sake, and it makes it nice because the integrals are just 5, they just say stoning the Jamarat. But actually, there are two types of stonings that you are going to do, right? And when we talk about release from Ihram, that's going to become significant. So on the 10th, which is called the Day of Slaughter, on the 10th, which is called the Day of Slaughter, Yom an-Nahar, you stone the Jamrah that is called Jamrah al-Aqaba only. So the pilgrims stone one Jamrah called Jamrah al-Aqaba on the Day of Slaughter, which is the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. It is also called the Great Jamrah, meaning it's the largest of the three. The time for stoning Jamrah al-Aqaba begins at the magic hour of the middle of the night on the eve before the 10th. And all of the stonings last until the same end time which we will give you, right? So there is a stoning of Jamrah al-Aqaba on the Day of Slaughter, and that begins at the midpoint of the night on the eve before the Day of Slaughter, the night before the Day of Slaughter. You can begin stoning Jamrah al-Aqaba. They all have the same end time. All of the stonings have the same end time. The second type of stoning is on the days of Tashriq. On the days of Tashriq, which are what? The 11th, 12th, and possibly up to the 13th of Dhul Hijjah. 11th, 12th, and 13th of Dhul Hijjah are called the days of Tashriq. Those are the days following the nights that you spent at Mina. These Jamarat are at Mina. So what you are going to do is stone each of the Jamarat, starting with the smallest, then the middle, then Aqaba, right? And I have to go in that order. You start with the smaller Jamrah, then the middle Jamrah, then the greater Jamrah, which is Jamrah al-Aqaba. You stone each of those three, and that time is with Dhuhr. On each of the days of Tashriq, the time for stoning begins, right? So with the Dhuhr time on each of the days of Tashriq, these stonings of the whole set of Jamarat, of all three Jamarat, begin. Okay, so on the 11th at Dhuhr, the time enters to stone. Stone the smaller Jamrah, stone the middle Jamrah, stone Jamrah Aqaba. And there's sunnahs there, takbirs, du'as, all of that. And that's what you will cover when you do a longer Hajj course. We're just here doing the nuts and bolts. So you do that on the 11th. After Dhuhr on the 12th, You stone the smaller jamra, the middle jamra, the greater jamra. You can depart from Mina at that point, and that's somewhat beyond our scope, but there are two departures, an earlier departure or a later departure from Mina. Both of them are permissible. Do what your Hajj caravan does. What is organized for your Hajj caravan, do that. And they will explain to you how to do so. If you stay the last of the eves of Tashriq, the eve before the 13th, and you're also there on the 13th day of Tashriq, after Dhuhr you would stone smaller, medium, large. So that's the second type of stonings. They begin at Dhuhr on each of the Tashriq days. You stone all three of the jamras. The first type of stoning was on the day of slaughter, and you only stoned the greater jamra, al-jamra al-aqaba. And then stoning has conditions. Stoning has conditions that are beyond our scope. We'll list a few of them. And then also we want to give the end time for the stoning, right? So the stoning of the day of the Jamra Aqaba on the day of slaughter, the 10th of the Hijjah, you stone only that one. Its time begins halfway through the middle of the night on the eve or the night before the 10th, right? And we've said that's a magic hour. That's when Tawaf begins. That's when the time for the Rukn Tawaf begins. That's when the time begins for being able to shave your hair. That's when the time begins for stoning, the Jamra Aqaba. So at the midpoint on the night before the 10th of the Hijjah, the time for stoning al-Jamra al-Aqaba begins. When does it end? Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala salah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Alhamdulillah. Salli ala sayyidina Muhammad. Allahumma rabb hadhihi at-tamam wa salatu qaimat ala sayyidina Muhammad. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin. Naam. So the time for stoning al-Jamra al-Aqaba, it begins with the middle of the night on the eve before the 10th of the Hijjah. It lasts until Maghrib on the last of the days of Tashriq, which is Maghrib on the 13th of the Hijjah. You can stone any time between those two, and it is on time, right? If you wait until Maghrib comes on the 13th of the Hijjah, you've missed your opportunity, and you have to expiate for it. The stoning of all three jamras, the second type of stoning, all three jamras on each of the days of Tashriq, for each of those days it begins with Dhuhr times beginning. And it ends, all of them at the same time, which is Maghrib on the last of the days of Tashriq. So each day of Tashriq, its stoning begins at Dhuhr. It's best to stone prior to praying on that day. It ends at Maghrib on the last of the days of Tashriq, which means it is not late until that time. It's not missed until that time. So on the stoning for the 11th, you have from Dhuhr to 11th till Maghrib of the 13th. For the stoning of the 12th, you have from Dhuhr on the 12th to Maghrib of the 13th. The stoning for the 13th, you have from Dhuhr on the 13th till Maghrib on the 13th. and it's on time anywhere from those beginning times till that one end time of all of them, which is Maghrib on the last of the days of Tashriq. So that is the fourth of our duties, the various types of stoning, and again, or the stonings, and there's two types. One day you stone just Jamar al-Aqaba. On the other 2 or 3 days you stone all 3 Jamarat, and the details of those we have mentioned. And then lastly, the farewell tawaf. The farewell tawaf is a tawaf for anyone who is going to bid Mecca farewell, and that has to be done as the last thing that one does prior to one's departure from Hajj, and Allah knows best. And the conditions for the farewell tawaf are the same. Obviously, it will never be followed by a sa'i. Sa'i would have preceded it, so you will just do the farewell tawaf, and the sunnah prayer after the tawaf, and so on, and dua at the multazim, for instance, and then depart from Mecca. And the farewell tawaf should be the last thing that one does prior to leaving Mecca, and Allah knows best. And we will just conclude this section by saying that there are differences of opinion about some of these duties, whether they are duties or whether they are sunnahs. There are also excuses which allow one to miss some of these duties, such as an illness, or an illness that would allow you to sit in prayer can excuse you from stoning, for instance. An excuse for missing Jummah or congregational prayer can allow you to not have to spend the night at Mina. And there are also schools where these are sunnah. So Hajj is a place to be lenient, and the Prophet ﷺ was extremely lenient on Hajj, and you are likely to follow a group and perform Hajj with them, and you should seek out a group that is knowledgeable, that will give answers to fiqh questions, to questions in sacred law according to one of the 4 Sunni legal schools. And if you are traveling with such a knowledgeable group, with a knowledgeable group that we've described, and the group is going to do one of these obligations in a different manner than we have described, or even miss some of them, counting them as a sunnah, which is a view in other schools, and even a difference of opinion in our school, we would advise you to endeavor to not oppose the group in a manner that causes you or other members of the group undue difficulty. If it doesn't cause difficulty and they allow you to do it in a way that's more thorough in your school, then by all means do so. But if it is not possible, and that is often the case on Hajj, moving large groups of people around can be very difficult or even life-threatening. So we advise people not to be too rigid about these, and to understand that some things that we regard as duties may be regarded as sunnahs. Some things that we regard as sunnahs may be regarded as duties by other schools. So you may not be able to do everything in the manner that you have learned or in the time that you would prefer to have done so. And we would just advise people to follow the spirit that the Prophet ﷺ followed. When people would come and ask him on Hajj, I did this before that, or this or that, he would keep giving very easy answers, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So that is a prophetic sunnah in that context. And as we said before, this is a very excellent and succinct treatment. Habib Ahmad bin Zayn al-Habashi, he got a lot in despite the brevity of this text. So this is thorough in Hajj, but it's a thorough introduction. Prior to performing Hajj, you should take a Hajj course, and you should endeavor to make Hajj with a group that has people that are knowledgeable in the Sunni legal schools, that can give you fatwa and answer details in the more precise and obscure questions. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sallam, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Al-Fatiha. Yeah.